Hello and welcome back to Wine with Andy. I'm Andy. Now, I'm afraid to say that this is the last of this little Intro to Wine series of videos. But don't worry, I'll be back soon enough with a new series of videos. So just click on that subscribe link down below and you'll be notified as soon as they're up on the channel. Now, before that sorry moment when we have to temporarily part, we've got a whole tasting ahead of us. So let's get stuck into that. Today, we're looking at oak. It's the last of our essential building blocks of wine flavour. And before now, I've mentioned oak a few times in the series, but only really to ask you to make sure the wines you're buying have been unoaked. And that's because we didn't want that extra dimension to complicate the comparison. But today, I've asked you to buy one oaked Chardonnay and one unoaked Chardonnay, so hopefully you've been able to find something suitable. The choice of country was up to you, but I've gone for France. You could have gone for somewhere else. That's absolutely fine. And of course, if you don't have the wines to hand right now, don't worry, you can pause here. I'll still be waiting for you when you get back from the shops. There's a bit more information in the description down below about exactly what you'll need to get. So, oak. Now, oak is a tree, right? And wine is made from grapes. So what is a tree doing in my wine? Well, it's not really in the wine, of course. It's more that the wine has been in the oak. Now, oak is a material that can be used to make barrels that a winemaker can choose to store their wine in whilst it's being matured or whilst it's fermenting. There are other options available, things like big stainless steel vats or concrete, but oak is one of those things that a winemaker can choose. But where did the idea of using oak come from? I think there's an opportunity here for a quick wine story before we get into the tasting proper. So the story of wine goes back about 6 to 8 millennia to Georgia. That's the country Georgia, not the US state Georgia. And that's where and when we have the oldest archaeological evidence of winemaking. Now, for the first several millennia of wine production, the way it was stored was in clay pots. Big clay pots, small clay pots, decorative clay pots, ugly clay pots, but clay pots. And that continues up until the Romans. And of course, the Romans are the people we have to thank for many of the wine-growing regions around Europe today, including here in the UK. They really, really liked wine. So whenever they went and invaded somewhere new, they'd plant up wine grapes so that they could supply their local people, their local legionaries, local Roman people who were there to administer their newly invaded territories. And they were also really good at picking up on the bright ideas that the people they invaded had. One of those sets of people were the Celts, and they tended to make beer and then store it in oak barrels because they lived in a place where there were lots of oak forests. And the Romans saw this and saw that it had a couple of really good advantages over the clay pots, the special clay pots called amphorae, that they were using at the time. First off, a barrel is sort of quite usefully cylindrical and round, so that you can roll it around with fewer people. Even just one person can roll a barrel around quite easily and move stuff about. So that was useful for the transport of wine. And the other advantage was that clay, as I'm sure you know, is quite brittle, so it breaks easily, whereas wood is a bit more resilient, so it's a bit tougher. So they started using this oak barrel technique for transporting the wines around their empire. So wines from France would be stored in barrels and transported back to Italy, to Rome, to be drunk there. And they found that during that journey, the wine took on some really enjoyable characteristics from its time in the oak. They found that it imparted a bit of flavour and it changed the wine a little bit. And that's exactly why we use wine today. It stems from that historical connection. So the oak adds flavour from the oak itself. It's actually the flavour of the wood and of the charring inside the barrel. So the barrels are sort of burnt on the inside to help seal them up. So that sort of caramelised char flavour comes from the charring of the oak barrels. And they also add a bit of tannin to the wine because oak has a lot of tannin in it. You might remember last time I mentioned that lots of plants have tannins in them. Well, oak has a lot of tannins in it. so it can add a bit of tannin to the wine. And also, because oak rather is not totally airtight, it allows some oxygen into the barrel, and that reacts with the chemicals in the wine to help it sort of mature a little bit, to speed that up. So there's a couple of processes. It adds flavours from the oak itself, and it brings in some oxygen, which helps the wine develop a bit. So that's why we use oak. Now I think that's quite enough waffle from me. Let's get into actually tasting some wine. I've got my 2 identical glasses here ready to go. Now I'm going to pour my Unoaked Chardonnay into my left-hand glass. There we go, up to the widest part as normal. And my Oaked Chardonnay here into my right-hand glass. There we go. So I've got my 2 Chardonnays in front of me. Now, first step, let's have a look at the colour. I'm going to pick them up and tilt them against a light-coloured background. Now, there's really not very much difference at all between these two. And unlike the past couple of times, we're back to tasting 2 wines from the same grape variety. And because the grape variety is the biggest thing that changes the colour of the wine, we wouldn't necessarily expect too much difference between these two. The other thing that really affects colour is the age of the wine and the contact with oxygen. So you might potentially see that the wine that is oaked is a little bit darker than the wine that is unoaked. But because these are about the same age, that isn't really the case here. They both look pretty much the same colour to me. Next step, sniff. So I pick up my unoaked Chardonnay and I'm going to give it a sniff. So first thing, category of fruit. What category is it? Is it green fruit, white fruit, stone fruit? It's somewhere in that kind of region for me. I'm going to say it's kind of white flesh, maybe. Maybe the specific kind of fruit that I would go for this one would be a melon. And then thinking about the ripeness as well. So we've got category of fruit, we've got ripeness of fruit. The ripeness of this, it's sort of lovely and ripe, but it's fresh melon, it's freshly cut. It's not cooked. Don't know that you get melon jam, maybe you do, but it's not cooked and it's not underripe either. It is sort of nice and fresh. On to the oaked Chardonnay. Now, there's a little bit of the oak coming through there. I'm thinking it's going to be a little bit more prominent when we give it a swirl in a moment. So I'm just going to concentrate in on the fruit for now. And the fruit on this it's kind of ripe apple maybe. It's a similar kind of vibe, maybe a bit of melon, bit of ripe apple. It's perhaps a little bit more ripe tasting than the unoaked Chardonnay, but about the same. They are from the same country. These are from slightly different places in France, but they're both from sort of the southern half of France, so I wouldn't expect too much sort of climate-based variation. On to swirl and sniff. Let's give this a swirl. So I've got more of that kind of nice melony flavour coming through. I've also got a little bit of maybe sort of something a bit buttery, a little bit nutty, something like that. And those nutty flavours can be coming from the contact with the yeast during the fermentation and after the fermentation for a bit. That's some of the flavours you get from yeast. Yeah, but still that quite nice fresh melony fruit. Onto the oaked Chardonnay. Okay, yes, I can now get that oakiness coming through there a bit more. The fruit, though, let's concentrate on the fruit for a moment. The fruit, yes, definitely ripe, a little bit riper, definitely. It's kind of ripe red apple, that sort of fruit. Now, to see the difference, to see that oak a bit more clearly, I think it's going to be useful to be able to go back and forth between the two. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to swirl these two on the table because that makes it a bit easier. There we go. And then I'm going to sniff them one after the other and go back and forth. So in my wines, I can see that there's a core of fruit that's quite similar between the two. Hopefully you can spot that similarity as well. But then I can also see on my oaked Chardonnay that there's something else as well. There's this spicy, caramelly kind of flavour. Toasty even, like toast. And that flavour is what's coming from the oak. And in this wine, it's matching very nicely with the ripe apple flavours to give a sort of overall impression of something like apple pie. Now let's move on to tasting. So I've got more of that nice melon fruit, rounding out a little there with a bit of honey perhaps. We've got medium level of acidity, feels nice and light in my mouth. We've not really got any sugar, this is a dry wine, and I'm not feeling a particular burn as I swallow the wine from the alcohol, so it's not that alcoholic a wine either. Decent finish, nice sort of honeyed apple kind of finish there as well. On to the oaked Chardonnay. So I'm getting, again, more of that nice ripe fruit. And actually, I can really taste the oak as I suck the air through this one. I'm getting that kind of caramelized, slightly sort of generically spicy, I don't know, maybe it's clove or cinnamon, but it's quite generic, kind of a spicy smell. And I'm really getting that as I'm sucking the air through. The other thing that I notice with this is that I can actually feel those oak tannins. So if I swirl it between my teeth and my lips, I can actually feel a little bit of the tannins that have come from that oak. I don't know, you may or may not be able to get that as well. It depends on how oaky your wine is. But let's just do another quick comparison between the two to compare those tannins particularly. Okay, so not really feeling anything there. There is a very slight, but it's definitely there, very slight grippiness going on, astringency going on the inside of my lips there. And that is going to be coming from the oak. Now I mentioned it kind of depends how oaky your wine is, whether you'll be able to get that. What do I mean by how oaky a wine is? Well, oak is used, as I said, in the fermentation and particularly in the maturation of wines. It's left in barrels for a bit to mature. But not all of the wine that goes into the final bottle necessarily sits in oak barrels. You'll sometimes see on the back of a label that it says 40% oak or 40% new oak potentially. And what they mean by that is that only 40% of the liquid that goes into the final wine has actually been matured in oak barrels. The rest has probably been sitting around in stainless steel vats that don't impart any flavour. And what they mean by new oak is that the barrels are new. They've not been used before. And that's important because the flavours that sort of leach out of the oak into the wine, there's sort of a finite amount of them there. So when you use it the first time, you get lots of oak flavours coming out into the wine. That's the new oak. The next time you use that barrel, there's slightly less flavour there to come out into the wine. Some of it's already come out. So it's sort of diminishing returns. Your second year of use, you'll get a little bit of oakiness. Your third year, you'll get not very much. Fourth year, it's sort of virtually neutral kind of maturation barrel. So you can sort of see this progression in terms of how much oak flavour a barrel imparts to the wine, and that's why they talk about new oak on barrels. The other sort of variable in this is toast, and I mentioned that they sort of char the insides of the barrels. And they can do that to differing amounts. So you could have a low toast barrel or a high toast barrel where you've got a little bit of charring or lots of charring. And that will change the sort of amount of those caramelized toast, like bread toast flavours that you get in the wine. The more charring of the oak you have, the more of those toasty flavours you're going to get. So let's move on to the final part of our wine tasting routine, thinking about the wine. Now, you may or may not particularly like either of these, who knows? It's up to you. But hopefully you can see the difference, and you can see that there's a slight difference in flavour profile. There's a bit more complexity because there's more going on. The oak has an added dimension in the oaked wine. And we can use that when we're pairing things with food. So if I were pairing a fish dish with my wines here, I would perhaps pair just a nice simply cooked light fish with the unoaked Chardonnay, say a nice lemon sole or something, whereas I'd pair something a little bit more robust with the oaked Chardonnay. You could even try to match some of those toasty flavours. Say you might match breaded fish cakes or even fish and chips with the oaked Chardonnay. That would make quite a good match for this. So you can also try to imagine how that oaked flavour, if you sort of mentally try to subtract the fruity flavour from the Chardonnay, you can imagine how that oak flavour might also work nicely in red wines. And I'm sure if you find yourself with an oaked red wine sometime soon, you might be able to sit there and try and concentrate on separating out the oak flavour and the fruit flavour in that wine and see how they work together. Those two flavours don't necessarily remain separate though. As the wine matures, they sort of meld together to produce a sort of harmonious whole. And that's one of the reasons why aged wine is more expensive than just wine that's straight off the shelf from the supermarket. You'll get that kind of blending of flavours to create this lovely symphony that works nicely together. Now that's about all for our tasting today. I'm going to leave you to enjoy these wines, and I hope you found this little series of Intro to Wine videos informative, interesting and fun. I'll be back soon with some more videos, so click on that subscribe link and you'll get to know when they're uploaded. I'll see you soon. Cheers!